Well, good day. Hi, I'm Dan Stein, president of FAIR, and I'm joined today by Matt O'Brien, who's FAIR's director of research. Immigration, small migrant populations in big states have big impacts. We're going to talk about a recent report that has some unexpected findings put out by FAIR's research department. In states where you don't have a lot of immigrants, you would think that the impact would be small. But in fact, our crack research team has done an analysis of some of these interior states and some of the states which have smaller immigration populations and has found some very interesting things. So I want to talk to you a little bit about some of those findings today with Matt. Matt, who is key researcher along with Spencer Riley, put this report out about a week and a half ago, and it got some major national coverage. So welcome, Matt.
Thanks, Dan.
So what do you say about the key takeaways for the average American? What are we really learning here?
Well, probably the most important thing is that immigrants, both legal and illegal, living in these states, consume about $4,000 to $6,000 more in services than they actually pay for. So that means that the average American has around a $4,000 to $6,500 bill that comes with these immigrants, and that is paid by taxpayers.
All right, so let's say if we have a small state or a state where there are relatively few immigrants. So we're not talking California, we're not talking Florida, we're not talking New York, we're not talking Illinois, we're talking Mississippi, we're talking North Dakota, we're talking Maine.
New Hampshire, Maine.
$6,000 a person anyway? A family?
$6,000 an individual. So that's the deficit between what the taxpayers, who are illegal aliens or lawfully present aliens, between the services that they consume and what they pay out. And so that leaves a deficit that the U.S. taxpayer has to pick up. Now, if you're talking about...
Right, so in those small states, those small immigrant receiving states, each alien is using about $6,500 more of taxpayer money than they're paying in.
Correct.
Okay. Net deficit.
Net deficit.
Okay.
So if you're talking about a state like Maine or New Hampshire that is struggling financially, that is trying to rebuild its economy, that is a hefty bill, even when it's divided up amongst taxpayers. That means there's a significant proportion of that bill that's coming out of U.S. citizens' paychecks in the form of taxes that they're paying to support things like public schools, public transportation, things of that nature.
But some of these candidates like Pete Buttigieg, Mr. Small Town Mayor, he says, hey, we need immigrants to come in to a small town where there aren't maybe a lot of people anymore and rebuild the town. So what did your research find there?
Well, we found they're not really rebuilding the towns. If you take a look at Lewiston, Maine, their school system went from being one of the lowest ranking school systems already in the state of Maine to having a huge number of Somali, Sudanese, and other African migrants settled there, most of whom English wasn't their first language. And so the school system, which was struggling to give basic math and reading skills to U.S. citizens, is now trying to teach English as a second language to speakers of about 38, 39 different foreign languages.
And who wants to teach in Lewiston schools?
Well, that's a problem. Maine is such a small state. The salaries for teachers are good, but they're not fantastic. So the state is having trouble trying to attract ESL teachers, and there's a shortage in the U.S. in general of ESL teachers.
So who would want to move to Lewiston from the United States and put your kids in Lewiston public schools?
Correct.
Would anybody?
Lewiston, once upon a time, was a wonderful working class town. My family is from Maine originally, and I've spent time there. But it was very hard hit with the bottom out of the industrial economy in the United States. And so what the U.S. government has essentially done is taken a bunch of immigrants who are at the lowest end of the economic ladder with very few marketable skills and little English language ability, and they've dropped them into some of the towns in rural America that have been hardest hit by the change in the economy, the transition from a manufacturing economy to a tech economy.
Well, if you have questions or comments, I've got my little feed right here. We can take those questions and comments now. Talk to Matt O'Brien about their report. Large states, small migrant populations, big impacts. So, in terms of the politicians, why are they so, what is the argument for these small town mayors and others who say, well, we need immigrants to come in regardless of their skill set? And what are they motivated by? Refugees What are they motivated by if, in fact, it doesn't really economically produce the results they say they want it to produce?
Well, there's a lot of cash that comes with refugees, in particular, refugees and political asylees. Settling refugees and political asylees is a multi-million dollar, some say a multi-billion dollar industry in the United States.
But who's getting that money?
Well, a lot of that money is going into the coffers of the cities where these people are being settled, to pay for social programs and things of that nature. But a lot of it is just money that's being given directly to the refugees and asylees. And so, of course, they spend that in local supermarkets and things of that nature. But it's not bolstering the economy because it's not a sustainable source of cash. There are no new businesses being built. There's no new industries being imported. It's just people that come with a certain amount of money. And when that money runs out, the towns are in exactly the same place where they started, except they now
maybe they're worse off.
Well, they're worse off in the sense that they now have people who require significant services that most U.S. citizens living in those places don't. And so what happens is they sacrifice a huge short-term infusion for cash causes them to sacrifice long-term benefits, because you have these people come in with a bunch of money which then runs out, and then they're further straining the economy.
So which states did you actually study?
So we took a look at New Hampshire, Mississippi, Alaska, Maine, North Dakota, West Virginia, South Dakota, Vermont, Montana, and Wyoming.
Montana, Vermont, Wyoming. Okay, so for our viewers out there, if you were actually faced with a candidate or a politician who says, well, we need more immigrants to come fill the housing stock in South Bend, Indiana. I mean, what should our viewers be telling those politicians? What's the answer?
Well, I should be telling the politicians that filling the housing stock is not going to cure the economy. So if you bring people, they need jobs in order to be able to pay the rent. So merely having people show up with a short-term series of benefits from the government doesn't do anything to fix the economy in a place like Lewiston, Maine.
So you're better off attracting the business, right, which then attracts the people.
Yes.
Rather than bringing in people, putting them on welfare, and somehow hoping that something good comes out of that.
100% correct. And in New Hampshire and Maine, when those efforts were undertaken, they did things like attract credit card companies, so that New Hampshire is now building a service economy. The problem is that the economy is not growing faster than the government is injecting these populations of migrants into these towns, and that creates a big problem. But you also have an issue where North Dakota has been very successful with its oil boom. But what you have now is you have immigrants competing with people both at the lower end of the spectrum and at the top end of the spectrum. As service companies develop to kind of provide accounting and advertising, all these kind of services for oil companies, they started importing H-1B workers. At the same time,
they're foreign non-immigrant tech workers or trained workers.
And at the same time, at the bottom end of the spectrum, you have refugees and other people arriving who are competing for entry-level jobs with Americans who were hoping that this boom was going to be able to help them inch up the economic ladder.
That doesn't work, right? Because they're not really employable.
Well, it doesn't work if you're putting competition in the way. Otherwise, what happens is that there's an incentive for employers to put on training programs and to engage in extra efforts to recruit American laborers because they're the ones who are there. But when you start bringing in people from abroad who may have a basic skill set, or at the upper end who have been educated in places abroad, you now have competition for all the U.S. workers.
So if there were an argument for using immigration to repopulate a city that had been losing population, what is that argument?
I don't think there is an argument to repopulate a city using immigration. If you were going to use immigration to enhance the economy, then what you would need to do is have a merit-based system where you recruited people in the areas where we have shortages so that you're not recruiting competition. And in that way, you might repopulate some areas.
What about ethnic restaurants? We always hear about ethnic restaurants. What if you want to have some kind of novel cuisine?
Well, the fact is that 98% of new restaurants close within 2 years of opening, and most of them don't survive beyond 5 years. So ethnic restaurants are delightful if you want to eat an interesting type of food, but as far as a booster to the economy, they're not the entrepreneurial dynamo that a lot of people arguing in favor of importing immigrants to boost the economy would have you believe.
Okay, so what does this research suggest is the next step for us? What else do we want to know as a result of this, do you think?
Well, I think we want to know, is this dragging the economies in these places down? If you look at a state like West Virginia, which is trying to build a science, technology, engineering, and math economy, if you're all of a sudden bringing in software engineers from India, you're not really helping the local people who are graduating with majors in that field to get jobs, because the primary interest of foreign workers who are coming to the United States on a visa that allows them to work is not their salary. It's access to the United States and the potential to get a green card and stay here permanently. So they see any lower wages that they have to take as the cost of doing business. But when they take those lower wages, they're driving the overall wage market down and hurting American workers who are looking for jobs.
Yeah, Zygmunt Mikulek, there we go. He says they spend our money at the beginning, however, in the long run, we are all paying for them. It used to be that was not the case, or that you were not, right?
That was not the case. I mean, I grew up in Lynn, Massachusetts, which was a General Electric town. It had a massive General Electric plant. And in the Ellis Island period, the Great Wave, there were huge numbers of people, including my family, who came here with skills. As machinists and other kind of technologists,
Sure.
They found available jobs, but there were so many jobs that they weren't competing with Americans. That has changed now.
Now, the Trump administration decided to give states and localities the right to decide if they wanted to resettle refugees, which are very expensive, as you point out. What would be the argument for a politician saying, yes, I want to continue resettling refugees in my city or state?
There doesn't seem to be a valid argument.
I guess moral.
There is a moral argument that we need to help people who are truly in distress. What I found working for ICE and USCIS is the vast majority of asylum cases aren't legitimate.
Right.
So I think the U.S. should be re-examining that program. If you are a city or a state that truly has a shortage of some kind of occupation, and we can find people who have those skills, then that is effective. The mining industry in the 1980s started recruiting people from South Africa because they needed certain types of mining skills. But those skills were not anywhere available in the U.S., so those South Africans were not competing with any Americans for those jobs. And the other thing that has to be looked at is, if we do have a shortage of skills, we should probably only be looking at immigration as a short-term solution. Then we should be building a pool of that skill set in the United States.
So you think the Trump administration is on the right track now? The Trump administration is talking about moving to a merit system, curtailing refugee admissions, stopping illegal immigration. Those all sort of make economic sense from what we're looking at here in these affected states?
They do indeed. And I think the Trump administration is the first administration, probably since the Eisenhower administration, that understands the economic problems that are imposed by unchecked mass migration, and they have very wisely approached it.
So if I'm an activist and I'm confronted with a politician who says, hey, we need more immigrants in our city, what's my answer?
Well, the answer is, if you take a look at just the small populations in these places, there's a cost just for the illegal aliens in these states of $454 million. When you add that, the lawful immigrants, that it's much harder to calculate the cost because there's so many variables, but when you add that, it becomes a massively bigger figure. If we weren't spending that $454 million on illegal aliens, we could be spending it on all kinds of economic and employment training programs in those areas. But instead, we're spending that money on people that don't have any right to be in the United States at all.
So basically we would say, no, you are wrong, Mr. Politician.
Correct.
We have resources that we need to train our own folks for the jobs of tomorrow. We need to attract business here that will attract Americans from other parts of the country to want to live in our community. And we simply do not need to have mass immigration overwhelm our small town, right?
That is 100% correct.
All right. Well, listen, I hope you get a copy of this report. The name of the report is
Mass Immigration Has Oversized Negative Impacts on Low Immigration States.
Mass Immigration Has Oversized Impacts on Low Immigration States. Links are on our website. This is Matt O'Brien, our Director of Research. I'm Dan Stein. This is Fair, and thank you for joining.